You ever notice how human beings will say the strangest things with complete confidence? We tell someone to hold their horses when there's no horses. We spill the beans that no one asked us to spill. We butter people up, or perhaps we kick the bucket, or let the cat out of the bag. And then we act like all of that is a perfectly ordinary conversation. And maybe the funniest part is that we rarely stop to ask why. Well, that's what today's episode is about. The strange, funny little phrases that we use every day without even thinking, and what they reveal about the way human beings tell stories, preserve memory, and make nonsense sound normal. Because language is not just how we communicate facts, it's how we carry our culture. It's how old ideas survive. It is how 100 generations of people manage to leave their tiny little fingerprints throughout our speech. So, today, we're going to do a little language archaeology together. We're going to dig up some of those expressions, turn them over in our hands, and ask the important question: what in the world were we all thinking? And if we're lucky, we may discover that the oddest thing we say, they're often the most human things we could say. Ahoy, my crew. Welcome aboard. You've stumbled across the hold of the pirate therapist. I'm your host, Lee Perry. I am the pirate therapist. And this podcast is where we take a lantern into the dark corners of the human mind. We crack a grin at the absurdity of just being alive and maybe, just maybe, find something useful washed up on the shore. Well, I'm your captain for this voyage, and around here, we believe a good story, a sharp insight, and a well timed laugh can go a long way towards keeping the ship afloat. So, whether you're sailing through smooth waters or bailing out a little emotional flood below decks, you're in the right place. So, pull up a crate, loosen your grip on the rigging, and let's just head into a storm of curiosity, courage, and just enough mischief to hopefully make things interesting. So, welcome to today's voyage. Let's take a second and talk about something that may seem simple on the surface, but is actually quite rich underneath. Why do sayings stick? Why do certain phrases survive for generations while others fade away into silence? Why do some expressions live on in our mouths even after the world that created them has changed beyond recognition? Why do we keep reaching for the same old lines again and again across decades, across families, across cultures, as if they are something that we can't quite live without? The answer is that sayings are built to survive. They're built to survive because they are memorable. Human beings are not equally good at remembering everything. We are better at remembering things that have a rhythm or repetition, a rhyme structure, a strong image to attach to them. That's why a lot of sayings sound a little musical. They have a beat, a cadence, if you will, a shape. They're easier to hold onto than plain language. If I say better safe than sorry, it's a small line, but it has a rhythm. It's balanced, it's easy to repeat. And if I say the early bird catches the worm, it's not just advice, it's a picture, it's a story. It's a little scene that your mind can have an easier time hanging on to. That is part of the secret of why sayings stick. They're not just language, they're little packages of memory. They're designed to be passed along, they're designed to survive in the space between people. But there's more to it than that. Sayings are also they also stick because they're useful. They're not just interesting, but they are efficient. They allow us to communicate complicated ideas quickly. They let us say a lot with only saying a little. So instead of giving a long explanation, a saying can carry a whole point in a compact form. Instead of building up an argument from scratch, we can borrow a phrase that already contains the shape of the idea. That is incredibly valuable in everyday life. We are constantly trying to make sense of things, to encourage each other, to warn each other, to correct each other, to comfort each other, and to make ourselves understood. Sayings reduce the effort it takes to do all of that. That's why they stick. They communicate more easily. They make it faster, they make it more memorable, and they make it more social because sayings are also deeply social. They're not just tools for individuals, they're tools for groups. When you use a saying, You are doing more than just transmitting information. You are signaling a belonging. You are letting someone know that you share a common language, a common culture, or a common set of experiences. You are saying, without saying it directly, that I come from the same world as you. I know the same phrases. I know the rhythms. I know the stories. It's powerful. It's a connection. And sayings are especially good at creating that kind of a connection because they're shared. They're not private. They're not one person's creation. They are something that belongs to the group. They are passed down from parent to child, from teacher to student, from friend to friend, and from one generation to the next, because they become a part of the social fabric. They become part of the way people talk to each other, the way that they teach each other, the way that we are able to warn each other, and the way that we can comfort each other, the way that we can correct each other, even. They become part of that shared emotional shorthand that makes group life work. That's another reason that they stick. They aren't just words, they are relationships. They're bridges between people. They are a part of the glue that holds the families, communities, and cultures together. But there's still another layer to this. Sayings also stick because they create pictures in the mind. Human beings are not purely abstract thinkers. We think in images, we think in stories, we like metaphors. We understand that the world, or we understand the world through comparison. So when I say, don't count your chickens before they hatch, I'm not just giving you advice, I'm giving you a picture. I am giving you a scene, a story, if you will. And a picture is easier to remember than an abstract instruction. It's also more vivid. It is more interesting. And because of that, it is more likely to stick. That's why sayings survive so well. They're not just practical, they are imaginative. They aren't just efficient, they are memorable. They're not just words, they're the decoration, the furniture of the mind, if you will. And on top of all of that, sayings also stick because they carry an emotional weight. They're not generally neutral. They're not just dry instructions. They are loaded with feeling. They carry wisdom and humor, maybe caution, maybe reassurance, maybe encouragement. I don't know, sarcasm, affection, discipline, lots of things can go with these. And sometimes they even can carry a little bit of pain. They carry the voices of the people who used them before us. They carry the tone of the people who raised us, and they carry the emotional history of the people who shaped us. That's why sayings can feel so personal. They're not just language, they're inheritance. They are hand me downs from the past. They are the voices of our parents and our grandparents, of our teachers and our mentors and our friends, our communities, of our very cultures. They are the words we heard over and over until they became a part of us to the point that we use them without really thinking about them. They are the phrases we repeated until they became part of how we speak and think and understand the world. That's why they stick. They're not just words, they are memories. That's not just language, it's part of our identity. And that is also why sayings can feel so strange when you really listen to them, because they are carrying so much. They are carrying history, they're carrying our culture. They carry our family and our values. They are carrying the voices of the people who are no longer here, but who are still speaking. They're speaking words out of our mouths. So when you hear a saying, it may feel simple and it may feel casual. It may feel like something that you've always heard. But if you pause long enough to really listen, you will realize that it's not so simple at all. It is a little time capsule, it's a little bridge, it's a little piece of belonging, it's a little piece of the people who came before us. And that's why they stick. It's not because they're perfect, and it's not because they're logically flawless. It's not because they're technically efficient. It's because it's part of our experience as a human being. These sayings, they help us remember and connect. They belong. They help us feel like we belong. Like they help us to communicate. That's why even when the image is old and the phrase is antiquated, it still feels alive and we still use them. Even when the horse is gone, we still hold our horses. Even when the beans are spilled, we still spill the beans. And even when the cat is long gone outside of that bag, we still let the cat out of the bag. Even when the midnight oil is long burned out, we still burn the midnight oil because the human heart is still trying to describe the same storms, the same experiences. The human heart is still trying to make sense of these challenges that we face that are the same that the people that came before us faced. The human heart is still reaching for that language that can carry all of that without a crushing weight attached to it. That's why sayings stick. Now, here's a humorous part. A lot of phrases we use every day are carrying around pictures from a world that most of us do not live in anymore or have not ever lived in our entire lives. Like hold your horses. Even though most of us are not standing beside a wagon or a carriage or any kind of literal team of horses that needs calming before someone makes a reckless decision, we say hold your horses, even though most of us are not standing beside a wagon or a literal team of horses that need calming before someone makes a reckless decision. We say spill the beans as if confidential information is a can of legumes that must somehow be knocked over at just the right moment. We say let the cat out of the bag, or butter someone up, bite the bullet, burn the midnight oil, throw in the towel, kick the bucket, bury the hatchet, call it a day. It's raining cats and dogs. If you pause long enough to hear these phrases literally, they sound like fragments from a story that has lost its context but kept its costume. That's part of what makes them so funny. They sound normal because we've heard them so often. But if a visitor from another planet were to drop by in the middle of our conversation, they would probably think we were extremely unwell with a serious livestock problem. And yet, the phrases still work. Why? Because the image may be old, the human feeling underneath is not. We may not be living in the original world that created the phrase, but we are still living in a world where people need to be told how to slow down, how to keep quiet, or soften their tone, or to prepare for hardship. We have to remember how to admit the truth, to persist, to reconcile, to survive long stretches of exhaustion. The object may be outdated, but the emotional map of it is still recognizable. The metaphor survives because the experiences survive. And that is the most fascinating thing about language. It is not merely a tool for efficiency, it is a museum we carry in our mouths. Every time we speak, we're speaking around with little relics of earlier eras tucked into our sentences. Some of these phrases came from farming life, some from a seafaring life, some from warfare, some from trade, some from a domestic life, and some from customs that we barely remember. The original object may have disappeared, but the phrase that keeps moving through time like an heirloom passed from hand to hand, it may be worn smooth now, and we may not know exactly where it came from, but it still feels useful enough to keep in circulation. And that's why outdated imagery can survive so well. A saying does not need to be literally current in order to remain emotionally current. In fact, sometimes the very strangeness of the image helps it last. A phrase with an odd picture is often easier to remember than a plain instruction. Be careful is useful, but hold your horses gives the brain something vivid to grab onto. Don't reveal a secret is clear, but spill the beans is a little absurd. And absurd tends to stick. The weird image acts like a hook, it catches the mind. And if our minds love pictures, we are not purely abstract creatures. We understand through symbols, stories, and comparisons. If I say someone bit the bullet, I may not be describing an actual bullet or an actual bite, but I am borrowing the feeling of enduring something unpleasant with grim determination. And if I say someone burned the midnight oil, I am not asking you to picture a lamp from the 1800s in a smoky room. I am evoking a feeling of long labor, sleeplessness, and effort stretching late into the night. The old object is gone, but the emotional meaning is still alive. And that may be a real secret of these phrases. They are not really about the objects at all, they're about the human conditions that we have attached to them. We still understand the ache of fatigue and the embarrassment of exposure, the urgency of warning and the humor of surprise and the relief of resolution. So even when the image is ancient, the meaning stays accessible because the emotional world is still the same. We do not need to live in a horse and buggy era to understand caution. We do not need to live in a world of actual midnight oil to understand exhaustion. We don't need to live with literal sacks and cats to understand the feeling of a secret slipping out into the open. And that's what gives old sayings their strange durability. They outlive the future of the world that made them, but they keep surviving because they continue to describe the furniture of the soul. And there's something charming about that. These phrases remind us that language is not just a modern convenience, it is a historical memory. It carries with it the fingerprints of old jobs, of old tools and fears and routines, old ways of making sense of daily life. A saying can survive for centuries because people keep finding it useful to describe new situations with old images. The costume may change, but the emotional script stays recognizable. You could even think of them as little time travelers. They arrive from another era wearing clothing of another century, but they keep showing up to help us explain the present. They are a little dusty, perhaps, a little odd, and somehow they're still perfect for the moment. And that's why we keep using them. Not because they're technically modern, but because they help us explain our humanity. And that's a beautiful thing. It may be an outdated imagery, but it reminds us that in every generation we inherit pile of symbols from the one that came before it. And then we keep using those symbols to talk about our own versions of the same mess. The forms change, the tools change, even the settings change, but people are still people. We get overwhelmed, we still misunderstand each other, and we still get tired. Sometimes we even confess too much. We still try to hold the sound wiser than we feel. We still reach for those old phrases because they somehow know how to say what we are feeling better than the plain sentence ever could. So, yes, the imagery is outdated. The horses are gone and the beans have been spilled. The cat is already halfway down the street. The midnight oil has long since burned out. But the language remains because the human heart is still trying to describe the same old storms in a whole new sea. Now, let's talk about something a little deeper hiding inside of all of this language. Sayings are not just words that people repeat for convenience, they are social tools. They help us to feel like we belong. A saying can do in 5 seconds what a longer explanation might take a whole minute to do. It can signal that you understand the room, that you know the culture, and that you've heard the same stories, that you see speak the same invisible language as the people around you. And in that way, sayings work almost like a handshake. You do not always notice it when it's happening, but the moment someone drops a familiar phrase into a conversation, something subtle can click into place. Yes, you are one of us. You know this pattern. You know this world. This situation makes sense. That is part of why sayings travel so well through families, through workplaces and neighborhoods and communities. They're easy to pass along because they are compact. They fit neatly into everyday speech. They don't require a long setup. They arrive preloaded with meaning, tone, and attitude. And often they carry a little extra emotional weight because they come from somebody specific. Maybe it's your mom or dad. Maybe it's a grandparent. Could be your teacher or a boss. Maybe it's just a friend or an uncle or a nosy neighbor. Doesn't really matter. Maybe it's just a person in the family who somehow had a phrase for everything. Most of us can probably hear the voices right now when you think of a specific phrase. Maybe your mother had a saying that she repeated whenever someone was complaining. Maybe your father had a line he used whenever life got messy. Maybe a grandparent had a phrase that sounded old even when you were a child. Maybe you grew up hearing expressions that now live in your mouth so naturally that you don't even usually notice them until somebody from outside your family asks, "What does that even mean?" That's that's when you realize that the phrase is not just a phrase. It's kind of an artifact from your family. It's a verbal heirloom, a tiny piece of inherited identity. And that is what makes sayings so social. They're not just efficient, they're relational. They carry the voice of the group. They tell a listener, This is how my people talk. That can include a region, a generation, a profession, a faith community, a subculture, a workplace. It could just be your own particular family. The phrase becomes a marker of belonging. And so it's also a marker of memory. It reminds us that our language is never entirely our own. We inherit a great deal of it from the people who shaped us. That inheritance can be comforting. There is something warm about hearing a phrase that feels familiar from childhood. It can sound like home, even when the actual home was complicated. Language has a way of carrying emotional residue. A saying can make you smile because it reminds you of someone you loved. It can make you roll your eyes because it reminds you of someone who overused it. And it can make you feel a little complicated because the same words can carry both affection and annoyance. And that's part of the richness of human speech. A phrase is never just a phrase, it's often wrapped up in a history. Sayings help people navigate social life by softening hard truths. Sometimes a direct statement is just too blunt. It's too harsh or too awkward for the moment. So a saying gives you a gentler wrapper. It lets people offer advice or correction or encouragement or warning in a way that feels less confrontational. Instead of saying you're making a stupid decision, I really think you should stop, a person might say, well, you know what they say, fools rush in where wise men fear to tread. And suddenly the message feels less like an attack and more like a shared lesson from the tribe. We do this because social life is delicate. People are constantly managing their tone and their face, embarrassment, pride, humor, permission. Sayings help with that. They can make criticism sound wiser, comfort sound more familiar, and advice sound less personal. They let people speak indirectly when directness might be just too sharp for the moment. They help us they give us a socially acceptable way to say what everyone already knows, but nobody wants necessarily to hear out loud. And because sayings are often shared, they can create a connection fast. If you and I both know the same expression, then we already have one small bridge between us. We both recognize the pattern. We both understood the joke. We both hear the echo of the same culture behind the words. That is why a simple phrase can make a conversation warmer, make it easier, more intimate. We're drawing from the same well. There's also a funny thing that happens when sayings are used in groups. They can become a little shorthand rituals. A family may have a phrase that gets repeated every time something goes wrong. A workplace may have expressions that everyone understands without needing an explanation. Friends may quote the same lines back and forth until the phrase becomes part of the friendship. At that point, the saying stops being just language and becomes a signal. It's not just what is being said, it is who is saying it, to whom, and in what shared world. That's why sayings can feel so alive in a conversation. They are a social glue. They bind us together through repetition, humor, memory, and recognition. They let us borrow the wisdom of people who came before us, and they let us participate in the living, breathing community of people around us right now. And maybe that's one of the most beautiful things about them. We tend to think of language as something practical. Maybe we just see it as functional, something that we use to transfer information. But sayings remind us that language is also communal. It helps people to find each other. It marks a belonging. It preserves family history. It keeps group memory alive. And even when the phrase is silly or overused, and oftentimes wildly outdated, it still carries the faint but unmistakable scent of human connection. So when you hear someone say, that's just how the saying goes, what they're really saying is something a little bigger than the phrase itself. They are saying, this is part of the world I come from. This is part of the voice that I inherited. This is part of the way my people make sense of things. And that is why sayings stick. It's not just because they're memorable or clever, and it's not because they're old, but because they help us to feel more like we belong. So let's wander over into one of the more entertaining parts of this whole topic, the moment when language stops behaving like a serious professional and starts acting like someone who has had too many cups of a morning beverage, too much caffeine. Because once you start paying attention, you realize that a lot of the phrases we use are kind of strange. They're not old, not just old. They're not just colorful. They're strange. And we say things every day that, if heard literally for the first time, would make no sense at all. We tell people to break a leg, kill two birds with one stone. It's raining cats and dogs. Cut to the chase. Burn that midnight oil. Take it with a grain of salt. Go the extra mile. Well, speak of the devil. We hear all these things, and somehow we do all of this with a completely straight face. If you stopped a person in the middle of a normal workday and asked them, why do you say any of that? They might blink at you like you're strange for even noticing. That is the magic of familiarity. Once a phrase has lived with us long enough, we stop hearing the absurdity. It becomes invisible through repetition. The weirdness is still there, but it's been domesticated. And honestly, that's a lot of the fun. Language gets weird because human beings get weird. We are symbolic creatures. We love a good metaphor. We love turning an abstract idea into an image that we can picture. We love borrowing from the physical world to describe the emotional one. So instead of saying, I am feeling awkward in this social moment, we may say, I don't know where to put my hands. Instead of saying the situation is growing complicated, we might say there's a lot going on here. Instead of saying that was embarrassing, we might say, well, that was a thing. We're constantly making reality a little more manageable by dressing it up in little odd phrases. And sometimes those phrases are so odd that they become delightful. There is a special category of weirdness that happens when people use sayings without understanding them fully. Most of us have probably heard the phrase all of our lives and only later realized, hang on a second, what does that actually mean? Or worse, we have confidently used the phrase that turns out to be slightly different from what we thought. Human language is full of these little traps. We inherit a phrase, we repeat it, and at some point we become so certain of it that no one notices it may not make complete sense anymore. The phrase keeps going because nobody wants to be the one to stop the parade. That's how language gets a little crooked over time. Sayings get shortened, blended, misheard, repurposed, and polished by use. They become little fossils with edges that are worn down. The original shape is still there if you look at it closely enough, but the details can get a little fuzzy. We don't always need to know the original history for the phrase to work. We only need the shared understanding that it means something useful now. And that's where the strangeness becomes charming rather than confusing, because a weird phrase does more than transmit information. It creates a mood. It adds texture. It makes language feel alive. If I say he was mad as a hatter, or she had a memory like a sieve, or they were up a creek without a paddle, you don't just get the basic idea, you get a picture. Maybe a ridiculous one, but it's going to be a vivid one. Maybe that's the one that makes you laugh, and a little spark of imagination is part of why that phrase survives. Weird sayings also remind us that language is not sterile. It's messy, it's historical, it's full of accidents that became habits and habits that became traditions. Some expressions come from old trades, some from war, and some from horse culture, from sailing, from farming. Some of our sayings come from old superstitions, and some from sources so obscure that scholars still argue about where they actually came from. But once they enter the common speech, they begin a second life. They no longer they no longer belong only to their origin. They belong to the people who keep using them. That second life is often a little odd, and that oddness is part of the charm. It's actually a relief, in a way, to realize that language can be both meaningful and ridiculous at the same time. We don't have to choose between poetry and practicality. Sayings give us both. They are efficient enough to use in a conversation, but weird enough to keep the imagination awake. They can be wise and silly in the same breath. That's a That's a fun combination, if you will. And maybe that's why we keep them, not because they're logically perfect, not because they're scientifically elegant, but because they're memorable. They're portable and they're just strange enough to catch something in our mind and hang on. There is something comforting about a phrase that sounds a little off. It reminds us that human communication has never been entirely neat. We have always been patching together meaning with borrowed images, half remembered stories, and the occasional absurd metaphor. We are all, in a sense, speaking from a shared pile of inherited weirdness. And somehow that works. So the next time you hear a phrase that sounds a little peculiar, pause for a second and enjoy it. Let it be strange. Let it be old. Let it be a little foolish and a little wise at the same time, because that is the shape of a lot of humanity's speech. Practical enough to get by, but imaginative enough to endure. And if that doesn't tell you something important about people, I'm not sure what will. Now we get to the part where all of this stops being just about funny phrases and starts to become a little more revealing. Because sayings are not only cute pieces of language, they are windows. They show us how people think, what they value, and what they fear. It shows us what they remember and how they learn to survive in the world that they grew up in. A society's sayings tell you a great deal about its priorities. If a culture is full of phrases about work, endurance, caution, thrift, or discipline, that tells you something about the kind of life that the people were living. If a family is full of sayings about patience and pride and keeping your mouth shut, not wasting things, or not acting above your station, that tells you something too. Sayings are like footprints left behind by generations of people who are trying to teach one another how to make it through the day. And because of that, they can be surprisingly intimate. The phrases people use most often are rarely random. They tend to reflect the emotional weather of the environments that they came from. Some sayings come from hard labor, some come from scarcity, some come from very strict households, some come from a faith tradition, some come from places where humor was a survival skill, and some come from families that prized independence. Some come from families that prized caution. Every saying carries a little trace of that world that made that saying. And that means when someone repeats a saying, they are often doing more than just passing advice. They're passing along a worldview. Now, think about that for a second. A single phrase can contain a whole philosophy of life. Don't make a fuss. Better safe than sorry. It is what it is. You made your bed. Now lie in it. Keep your chin up. Each one of these little lines says something about how a person has learned to deal with pain, uncertainty, responsibility, and disappointment. Some are encouraging, some are dismissive, some are practical, while some are resigned, some are hopeful, some can be fairly harsh. But all of them reveal something about an emotional toolkit of the people who repeated them. And that's why sayings can feel so personal when they come from a parent or a grandparent or someone in the family line. They are not just words, they're inherited strategies. A grandmother who says, "we'll manage," may be handing down resilience. A father who says, "get on with it," may be handing down toughness. An aunt who says, "Lord willing," may be handing down humility. And a sibling who says something over and over and over may be handing down a family joke that has become a verbal ritual. In each case, the phrase becomes a little container for identity. And of course, sayings reveal things about us individually too. The phrases we reach for without thinking often point to the stories that we were told and the people who shaped us and the values that we absorbed so early that we just no longer notice them. Some people speak in warnings, some in encouragement, some in sarcasm, some in old school practicality. Some use gentle humor, some in vivid metaphors, because they were raised in a world where plain speech was never seen as quite enough or appropriate. So if you listen closely to the way someone speaks, can tell you not only what they believe, but how they learned to believe it. There's also something powerful about the fact that sayings often outlive the exact circumstances that created them. A phrase can survive long after its original world has disappeared, which means it becomes some kind of a cultural fossil. But unlike a dead artifact sitting behind glass, a saying is still active. It still moves through the people, and it still shapes how they think. It still shows up in the middle of a real argument. It's still real advice, and it's still real encouragement, and it may show up at family dinner. And that makes every saying a little historical and a little psychological. Historical because it carries the echo of another time, and psychological because it reveals how human beings try to organize life into something manageable. And that is one of the most interesting things about language. It doesn't simply reflect our inner world, it helps form it. The phrases we repeat shape the way we interpret events. If you are constantly surrounded by language that emphasizes caution, you may learn to see risk as a threat. If you are surrounded by sayings that emphasize perseverance, you may learn to see hardship as something that you just push through. And if you're surrounded by humor, you may learn to use laughter as a pressure valve. Sayings matter not because they're neutral, but because they're tiny, repeated lessons. So when we listen to sayings that people use, we're not just listening for style, we're listening for a kind of inheritance. We are listening for values. We are listening for family history, cultural memory, and emotional habit. We're listening for the stories that people learned before they had the words to explain them. And maybe that's why sayings have such staying power. They're not merely ornaments on speech, they are compressed meaning. They're little echoes of the people who came before us. They show us how human beings have always tried to make sense of suffering and love, work, time, how to make sense of each other. They show us that we do not just inherit names and places and possessions, we inherit language, we inherit metaphors, and we inherit a mental set of furniture, our own familial culture from the people who raised us. And that's kind of a strange but beautiful thing because somewhere inside of the ordinary phrases that we use without thinking, there is a whole buried archive of human life. There's a way of seeing, a way of coping, a way of being in the world. Every time we repeat one of those phrases, we're not just speaking, we are passing something forward. So when you hear an old saying, it may sound simple on the surface and it may sound silly, but underneath, there is often a whole family tree of meaning, a whole history of survival, and a whole set of beliefs about what kind of a world this is and what kind of people we have to be in order to get through it. And that, in the end, is what sayings reveal about people. They reveal that we are storytellers, that we're imitators. It reveals that we are shaped by the voices around us. They reveal that we are always trying to make life a little more understandable. And they reveal that even the smallest phrase can carry a whole human history inside of it. Now, let's just take a breath for a second and talk about something practical but important: communication in everyday relationships. Most of life is not made up of dramatic speeches and grand confrontations, it's made up of ordinary moments. A quick comment in the kitchen or a text message between errands. It could be a passing remark in the car or just a quick little joke at the dinner table. A question that's asked when someone is tired. Maybe it's a response given when someone is already stressed. These tiny exchanges shape the emotional weather of our relationships far more than we usually notice. The tone we use, the words we choose, and the shorthand that we rely on all become part of the atmosphere of the people. It becomes part of that atmosphere that people live inside. And that's why communication matters so much. People are always trying to understand not just what we mean, but how we mean it. They're listening for whether we are calm or sharp, open or closed, kind or impatient, interested or distracted. In close relationships, especially, communication is not just about transferring information, it's about reducing distance. It's about helping one another feel personal It is about helping another person feel understood, respected, and safe enough to keep talking. A lot of work on healthy relationships happens in those small moments where someone is trying to say something true without turning the conversation into a fight. And that's where sayings can be remarkably useful. They reduce the effort it takes to get a point across. And instead of building on long an explanation from scratch, a saying can carry an idea in a compact, familiar package. It saves time, yes, but it also saves energy. It lets people communicate quickly without having to explain every layer of meaning. And that can matter a great deal in family life, in friendships, in marriage, in parenting, and in work relationships. A well-placed a well-placed saying can make a point memorable. It can soften correction. It can lighten a difficult moment. It can communicate frustration without turning into something harsh. It can offer encouragement without sounding overly formal. Sometimes a proverb or a phrase does the job an entire paragraph or several paragraphs could do because the listener already knows the shape of the thought. That shared understanding makes the exchange easier. For example, instead of saying, I think we need to be cautious here because this could create more problems than it solves, someone might say, let's not put the cart before the horse. It's faster, it's easier, and often more natural in conversation. Instead of saying, I think we should stop arguing and deal with the issue directly, someone might say, let's just bury the hatchet. A saying condenses meaning the way a good headline does. It gives you the core of the message quickly, and then the listener kind of fills in the rest. And there's another reason sayings matter in communication, and that is one of that people sometimes overlook. Sayings are not always as universal as we think. We often assume that a saying that somebody around us knows must be a general saying, something that's widely shared by the whole entire culture. But a surprising number of phrases that feel completely normal are actually much more local than we feel. They come from a family culture or just a regional culture. Maybe it's just something in our neighborhood or our church. What feels common to us may actually be inherited from a very small, specific group of people. And that is something that's really cool about language. It's both shared and intimate. A phrase can sound public while belonging to something very personal. Maybe your family had a saying that everyone repeated so often it felt like standard language. Could be that your parents had a phrase that got used every time somebody got into trouble. And maybe there was a line one parent said so often that it now lives in your mouth without much thought. To you, it may feel like just a saying, but to someone outside that circle, it could sound unusual, funny, or even confusing. And that's because language is part of a family identity. Families develop their own verbal habits the same way they develop their own traditions, their recipes, and nicknames and stories. A saying can become a marker of belonging. It can be a little inside joke that tells you who is from our people. Sometimes those sayings are practical, and sometimes they're funny. Sometimes they're odd enough that nobody outside the family would even know where they came from, but they carry a lot of emotional information. They tell you something about how that family understood the world, how they solved problems. It even tells you sometimes how they expressed affection or corrected each other. And this is true in smaller cultures too, a workplace, a hometown, a church group, or a hobby community, or in a close circle of friends that may develop phrases that sound perfectly ordinary inside of the group and perfectly strange outside of it. That doesn't make them less meaningful. If anything, it makes them more revealing. It shows us that communication is always happening inside layers of our shared story. We don't just speak English or Spanish or any other language. We also speak our families, our religions, and our communities, and our childhoods, and our relationships. So when we use a saying, we are doing more than saying words, we're reaching into a shared inheritance. We are drawing on language that has already been shaped by the people around us. We are borrowing a phrase that may have been passed down so often it now feels natural on our tongues, even if it came from a much smaller world than we realized. That is part of what makes sayings so powerful in everyday relationships. They're efficient, yes, but they're also loaded with a memory or a history. And because communication is so central to a relationship, this matters more than it might seem at first. A phrase can either connect or create distance. It can invite someone into understanding, or it can make them feel left out if they don't know the reference. It can strengthen closeness when both people share the same shorthand. It can also reveal a difference in a background, which can be useful in its own way. Either way, it tells the truth about how people live together in language. That's why good communication is not just about speaking clearly, it's about noticing the world of your words and where they come from. The things we call common are often shaped by specific homes, specific histories, or specific groups of people who passed them along until they felt universal. The truth is, many of our most familiar phrases began as a private language somewhere. They started out small, maybe among a family or a trade, perhaps in a small church group or a subculture, and then they grew wide enough that we forgot where they came from. So when you hear a saying, it may be doing more than making a point. It may be carrying a whole little world inside of it. And that's what makes everyday communication so fascinating. We're not just exchanging facts, we're sharing a piece of ourselves. We're using inherited language to make current life more manageable, more comprehensible. We are building understanding out of shorthand, memory, and trust. And sometimes the shortest phrase in the room is actually the one with the deepest roots. That's a quiet magic of sayings. They they make communication easier, but they also remind us that every word we use belongs to a history that is bigger than just us. Now, as we approach the end of this episode, I want to invite you into a small experiment. I want you to go ahead, just pause for a moment, even if you're driving, just if you're cooking, washing dishes, doesn't matter. If you're just walking somewhere with your headphones, just give yourself a few seconds and listen to the language that lives inside of your own life. Think about the sayings that recur in your world. Think about the phrases that show up again and again without you even noticing. Maybe your mother had a line that she repeated when someone was complaining. Maybe your father had something that he said whenever life just got stressful and messy. Maybe a grandparent, an aunt, a teacher, a coach, or a boss had a phrase that still lives in your mouth. Maybe there's a saying in your family that they use every time something goes wrong, or every time someone achieves something, or every time someone needs to be reminded to just, whoa, slow down, take a breath, take a moment. Notice that what those phrases are. Notice what they sound like. Notice what kind of a world they seem to come from. Some of them can be old, and some might be funny, and some might sound wise. Some may even sound practical. Some may sound like they were invented by a tired adult who needed a shortcut to explain a complicated idea just so they could step away from it. And maybe some of them just sound a little strange when you really listen to them for the first time. And here's an important part: they're not random. The phrases we repeat are not just words, they are inherited. They are shaped by the people who raised us, the communities we grew up in, the cultures that we belong to, and the experiences that left the deepest mark on the people in those cultures that was shared with us. They carry the emotional tone of the places that we've come from. They carry the values we were taught before we even knew we were being taught anything. They carry the voices of the people who are still alive in our language, even if they're no longer here in body. That's why sayings can feel so much larger than themselves. They're not just clever phrases, they're little containers of memory. They're handwritten notes from the past, passed down through the hands and mouths of generations. And when we use them without thinking, we're not just speaking, we're carrying something forward. So today, I want to invite you to pay attention to that. Listen for the sayings that live in your family. Listen for the phrases that feel like they belong specifically to you and to the people you grew up with. Listen for words that sound like home. Even if your idea of home is complicated, pay attention to how those sayings show up in your conversation, your arguments, your jokes, your advice, your comfort, your corrections. Notice how they shape the way you speak and maybe how they shape the way you think. This is a kind of language archaeology. You're digging through everyday speech that you barely notice, and you're finding fossils with history inside of it. You're uncovering the layers of people and places that made you who you are. You're listening for the voices that live on inside of your own voice. And you're realizing that even the most ordinary phrase can carry an entire story inside of it. That's one of the quietly beautiful things about being a human. We're constantly borrowing old words to describe new experiences. We're constantly using inherited language to make sense of the present. We're not just speaking to transfer information, we're speaking to connect. We're speaking to belong. We are speaking because language is one of the ways that we stay in a relationship with people who shaped us, the people that we love now, and the people who will come after us. So when you leave this episode, I want to leave you with one more question. What sayings do you want to pass on? Not just what phrases do you use, but what phrases do you want your children, your friends, your coworkers, your family, and even your future self to find inside of your voice? What kind of language do you want to leave behind? What kind of shorthand do you want to create? How do you want to share your wisdom, your humor, your warmth, your honesty, your resilience? How do you want to encode in phrases that stick around with people who know you best? That's a powerful question because the way we speak doesn't just reflect who we are, it also shapes who we are becoming. Everyday communication is how we build relationships. It's how we repair misunderstandings and express care. It's passing our values and creating a sense of belonging. A saying can be a very small thing, but it can also be a bridge. It can be a reminder that someone cares. It can be a way to say that you're not alone in this. And it can say, I understand. It can be a way to say that, hey, we're in this together. And maybe that's the real point of this. All of this language. It's saying stick because they help us to do what we're always trying to do as a human being, connect. They help us to reduce the effort it takes to get a point across, but they also give us a way to carry the past into the present. They make communication easier, but they also remind us that even our most familiar words come from a world that is bigger and deeper than just ourselves. So the next time you hear an old saying, take a moment and listen to it again. Let yourself be curious about where it came from. Let yourself be curious about what it carries. And let yourself be curious about what it says about the people who shaped you and the communities that you belong to. And then, if you're willing, let yourself be a little more intentional about the language that you pass on. Because the phrases we repeat are not just words, they're echoes, they're fingerprints, they're little pieces of our history that we leave in the mouths of other people. And one day, someone will use one of our sayings without even realizing where it came from. They will carry it forward, and it will become part of their inheritance too, just as sayings we grew up with became part of ours. So when you close this episode, when you take off your headphones, when you step back to your day, remember this. You're not just speaking, you're continuing a conversation that began long before you arrived, and one you will not be the last one to finish. Human beings are extraordinary. We have built airplanes, we invented the internet. Somehow, we still tell each other to hold our horses. We still want to spill the beans or hold the beans, or we don't want to let the cat out of the bag, or we don't want to bite the bullet, or we want to bite the bullet, or we're willing to bite the bullet. We burn the midnight oil. Even though these images are old, the feelings they carry are still alive. We're still tired. We're still afraid. We're still trying to slow down because we move too fast. We still want to tell the truth. We're still trying not to give up. We still want to make sense of our world. We're still reaching for a language that can carry all of that without crushing us under its weight. That's why sayings stick. That's why language matters. That's why communication is at the heart of every relationship. It's why even the silliest phrase, there's often a little piece of something sacred, the quiet, enduring human need to be understood, to belong, and to pass on something useful to the people who come next. Remember that we are human beings. We borrow old words and phrases to describe new experiences. It's more than just communication, it's also about connecting to each other and using familiar words that can bring a sense of that. Thank you for being here this week. I am Lee Perry. I am your pirate therapist, and I am signing off. So until next week, till next time, keep your sails full, your crew close, and keep your language kind.